Often, when we look at the history of our world, it seems as though government types clump together. The Bronze Age city-states had their priest kings. Carthage, Rome, and the Greek city-states, most of them at least, had some form of election in their governments. And this only ended when the Roman Republic turned to an empire. And after the Roman Empire fell, Europe had different governments, but it was the same system, feudalism, that charming pyramid scheme of a government. Democracy spread in the wake of the French Revolution and became a very dominant form of government up to and including our present day. But why? Why do government types converge over time? When don't they converge like this? Is there resistance to this type of convergence of governments? And what does it mean for you as a fantasy world builder? That's what I want to talk about today. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Just before we get into today's video, if you want to help me make more videos and read some really cool fantasy books, you can check out my books. There is my epic fantasy series, The Sangwheel Chronicles, my science fantasy book, Magic Fall, which I wrote with my podcast partner, Drake, or if you like erotic fantasy that isn't just elven prawn, check out my work under the pen name Talia Tethers. Links to all of those in the description of this video. Thank you very much to everyone who has bought my books and who has left a review. I appreciate every purchase and especially every comment. Okay, enough of that. Let's get cracking with convergent government models. First, let's talk about why governments would converge in this fashion. There are a couple of reasons why we see this type of similar governments arising in the same area and time period. The first and most obvious reason why governments converge over time is cultural diffusion. So, cultural diffusion is the spread of things like ideas, styles, religions, technologies, and languages between cultures. This is a very complex topic, so I am going to just dance over this briefly like a gazelle leaping over the plains of Africa. If you want to see a deeper dive into cultural diffusion and how to use it in fantasy world building, let me know in the comments. Okay, so this is the brief overview of cultural diffusion. There are 5 major types of cultural diffusion. Expansion. An idea is developed in one area, it remains strong in that area, and then it spreads outward. A great example of this is the spread of Christianity from Rome. Rome is still the seat of the Catholic Church, and Christianity remains strong in Rome, but it has spread out over all of Europe in these rippling waves, especially during the Dark Ages. Relocation diffusion. This is when a thing moves with people who move. So, for example, the various dishes that have spread around the world with immigrants like curries from India or sushi from Japan. Hierarchical diffusion. This is the spread of ideas from larger to smaller places, often influenced by social elites. The best one I can come up with here is fashion. And if you've ever seen The Devil Wears Prada, you know exactly why I say that. And you really should see The Devil Wears Prada. It's a great movie. But basically, fashion starts with elites in hubs like Paris, Milan, and New York. Trends are then adopted by influencers, and that eventually trickles down to the rest of us who, buy our clothes at normal stores. Contagious diffusion is when ideas spread via person-to-person contact. We all absolutely know this one. We call them memes and they spread like wildfire. And finally, stimulus diffusion is a concept that spreads based on its attachment to another concept. So, for example, the fast food concept via McDonald's spread to India. it ran up against the problem of no beef for beef burgers because of the Hindu environment. So the idea of fast food spread, but the implementation had to change for the culture by offering things like Makaloo tiki burgers, which are potato based. So those are the 5 models of cultural diffusion. Now, I'm sure that you can see based on these examples why cultural diffusion also spreads governments. Governments are often based on concepts. For example, democracy, the idea that citizens in your region, however you define citizens in this case, should have a say in their government. Or perhaps the idea is that the priest knows the will of the gods and therefore should govern, for example, the priest kings of the Bronze Age. Or feudalism, for example, if I can make everyone below me give me 5% of their authority, we can keep the peasants scrabbling in the dirt forever. Yeah, I'm prejudiced against feudalism. What gave it away? So, cultural diffusion definitely played a large role in convergence government models. But it is not the only reason for this convergence. There is also environmental factors. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, this region had an arid climate and unpredictable flooding. For agriculture to work, you needed extensive irrigation, and this required communities to work together. So leaders arose to encourage that, and often those priest kings claiming that the gods had said when to sow the seeds, etc., were the leaders that arose. Now, these leaders oversaw the construction and maintenance of canals, and they ensured equitable distribution of water. This very naturally led to the centralization of control and bureaucracy of the government. And of course, as the city-states grew and interacted, they all basically had the same idea, and the idea of centralized government reinforced each other through cultural diffusion. So the emergence of empires, the written law codes, even writing itself, all of this was strongly influenced by the environment in which these civilizations arose. And this very environment led to the convergent government systems. And for more on my thoughts on the Bronze Age, check out my series of the fantasy world building through the ages in the information card. The third reason for convergent governments I have already touched on in the environment section, and that is empire. So this could also be called forced diffusion, where one culture imposes their government on another culture. The Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Mayan Empire, the European colonial period, the examples are sadly absolutely myriad in our world. And of course, the colonizing power quite often simply supplants the existing government. There are exceptions to this in terms of colonization and empire, and we will talk about those. But often empire leads to convergent government by force of the colonizing power spreading its government. So I think those are the 3 main reasons why governments converge in a given time and region. If you can think of more reasons for this kind of convergence, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look at why governments converge, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about when convergence doesn't happen. Convergence of government models is not a given. European governments often seem to move in a block, and we'll get back to that and what happens when there's resistance. But Asia, as a contra-example, is home to many diverse forms of government. Of course, one reason is quite simply size. Europe is quite small in comparison to Asia's sprawling mass, and that enormous size has led to a degree of isolation at different times in history. The Himalayas are not easy to cross. The Gobi Desert is an imposing barrier, and bodies of water like the South China Sea kept both people and cultural diffusion at bay. By comparison, Europe is a breeze to cross, despite the Alps and a couple of other environmental barriers. Because of the vast distances and the barriers in Asia, Asia has a much greater cultural diversity than Europe, separated by language families, religions, and history. I think language is perhaps the greatest example of this. If you plonk down the Indo European languages across Europe, it covers essentially every country except Hungary, Finland, and Estonia, which are part of a different language family. But in Asia, this is completely different. Asia has some Indo European languages, but they also have Astro-Asiatic, Austronesian, Caucasian, Dravidian, Afro Asiatic, Turkic, Sino Tibetan, and Kradai. And of course, that's just the big language family. So naturally, ideas spread less easily, and empires, while vast, are often very lightly governed because you couldn't be everywhere at once given the sheer scale. And speaking of colonization, the Chinese model was rather different from the Roman one. Rome, which basically set the blueprint for Europe's colonization models, moved into a country, they set up shop and exported their culture to that country. China, on the other hand, had many tributary regions who weren't directly controlled by the Chinese emperor but did pay tribute. They were influenced by China, but they rarely adopted the exact governance model of China. Again, I think this had to do with the vast distances and the rather steep barriers on the continent. And for an idea of the scale that I'm talking about, here is the Roman Empire and here is the Mongol Empire, both at their peaks in terms of landmass. If you compare them to each other, you can see that the scale is dramatically different for Asia. And this also applies to the last point, why Asia didn't converge. Religion. Europe basically solidified their religion around Christianity. It spread outward with the Roman Empire and it survived the fall of Rome, becoming a unifying force, even giving rise to the Crusades. By contrast, Asia has a lot of different religions and philosophies. Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam have all played roles in shaping governance models. For example, the Islamic caliphates influenced governance in West Asia, while the Dharmic religious ideas shaped the kingdoms in South and Southeast Asia. So, my rule of thumb for governance convergence is when a region is contained enough that cultural diffusion can easily happen, you will often see government convergence where governmental models will follow the same pattern and over time. And you can see this in Asia, but only if you split the giant continent up by regions that can easily communicate, that aren't so separated by the environment. However, cultural diffusion can be resisted. Is it a losing cause to do so? Maybe. We'll talk about that next. But before we do, if you found value in today's video, consider giving it a super thanks. And let's talk about Europe's grand coalitions versus the spread of democracy. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, France famously latched on to the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and this led to the French Revolution and the creation of the French Republic. Now, of course, there was a lot of back and forth around various types of government. Napoleon started out as the first consul and ended up as the Emperor of France, but those details are a whole different ball game, and the point I'm making here is that the monarchic government of France, the ancient regime, the king because God said so, was kicked out of France. And if you want my thoughts on revolution, check out my video on the topic. Now, this process of kicking out the monarch really made the European monarchies as nervous as cats in a bathhouse. They feared the spread of revolutionary fervor that would jerk their thrones out from under them, especially since the French Revolution had provided a great demonstration of how quickly nobles get sent to the wall, or the guillotine for that matter. So first, they tried to basically contain the ideas of the French Revolution. Then they tried to reinstate a king in France. And then war broke out. Now, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. Europe is the PvP server of the world. A lot of people squashed together in a relatively small space with not much in the way of environmental factors. It's inevitable. Anyway, the point is, between 1792 and 1815, Europe was largely at war, with major powers like Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain all trying at different times to curtail or eliminate the revolutionary and Napoleonic threat. It took six grand coalitions before they finally managed to defeat Napoleon. And after they did, Europe had a conference in Vienna led by a dude called Metternich, who was the Austrian prime minister. And they all agreed that France had to be contained, and they tried to suppress the revolutionary movements and uphold monarchical rule. It was absolutely not to be. While the monarchies were successful in suppressing republicanism in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic War, the ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, spread widely across Europe, and they influenced a number of movements and revolutions and reforms across the continent, resulting in democracy now being the dominant form of government in Europe. So, what this bloody little interlude of history underscores is that convergent governance doesn't always occur smoothly or quickly. There's often resistance, especially from entrenched powers that feel threatened. Now, ideas are often kicked in the teeth by the powers that be. This is a natural sort of progression of an idea. However, if an idea is powerful enough that it trumps people's current comfort levels, so that the promise of the idea is greater than the comfort that they currently enjoy, those ideas do have a way of surviving and spreading, even if they take decades or centuries to become dominant. In your world, this kind of convergence and resistance to it can be an amazing form of tension. And where there is tension, there are awesome plot hooks for your story. So, when you're thinking about building your regions and creating governments in your world, consider how those governmental systems have converged, and if they've converged at all. Are all your governments in a given region the same? If the answer to that is yes, then convergence has applied to your region. But what if you don't want that? Maybe you have one holdout kingdom among a string of democracies. If so, why? Are they geographically isolate? Is the government really so oppressive that it just maintains control? Or maybe the monarch is magic, and as such keeps his people so happy they don't need a voice in government. And don't forget to also think about religion's influence, especially if your gods are real. If the gods are real, you might have more or less convergence. You'd probably have less if different people have different real gods, because they would then be the chosen people of that god and less likely to converge. If, on the other hand, the gods over all of your world are real and people worship them by different name, you would probably have more convergence. And of course, if you have real gods, you probably also have a higher chance of theocratic governance, and as such, that would be your point of convergence. Whatever you decide to do with your regional models of government, just make sure you know why your government models are or are not converged. Whatever you decide will be an interesting point of world building for your readers to consume. And those are my thoughts on convergent government models for fantasy worlds. If you want to say thanks for this video, super thanks is enabled, or you could become a channel member to get these cool perks, including early access to my videos. If you enjoyed this video, do please check out my video on creating fantasy governments right over there. And it really does help the algorithm if you show the channel love by clicking on that video and watching it. And I will see you soon for another one. Go on, click the fantasy government video. I'm just hanging out here waiting for you to do that.